Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently reading Zechariah chapter 14, and we're going to get right to it. Now, this prophecy is of when Jesus returns. In other words, what is Jesus going to do when he comes? You always have people going, what would Jesus do? Well, what is Jesus going to do when he returns? And it is quite clear, and we have vivid details about what's going to happen. Now, we're not getting into, in this study here, about the rapture of the church, when the rapture of the church. We're just not doing it here. But I will point out something as we move on in this chapter that's kind of indirectly mentioning the church. Okay. So let's get to it. Last time we opened up with a day of the Lord is coming, okay? And he says, when your plunder will be divided in your presence. So now this prophecy is about Jerusalem. And it's very important to understand that the prophecies are concerning Jerusalem. Very important. So then he says, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem for battle. Now this battle, we're going to get more into it further down in more detail. In other words, what is going to happen in this battle? And notice God is gathering the nations. Okay? And just so in Joel, and from this perspective, this is probably almost 300 years. Joel was, again, about 300 years before his time. Let's be on the safe side, say 250 years. He says, this is Joel chapter 2, and he says, yes, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. Now, this very interesting prophecy here, because he says, when I restore the fortunes, when I restore the fortunes, of Judah and Jerusalem, because we're going to see this process of restoring Judah and Jerusalem is going to be quite brutal at first. But notice what he says, I will gather all nations and take them to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there. Okay? So, a lot of these prophecies, in terms of their fulfillment, have to do with, again, what God is plan and purpose for Jerusalem. He says, the days are coming when your plunder will be divided in your presence. Now, it gets worse, okay? Verse 2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem for battle. The city will be captured, houses looted, the women raped. Half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be removed from the city. You're talking about a time when the world will close in on Jerusalem. And in Revelations chapter 12, you see where the dragon, who is Satan, the serpent, makes war against Israel, Jerusalem, and tries to destroy the nation. So notice he said the city will be captured, though. In other words, before the Lord comes, before the rescue, there's going to be great misfortune for Israel. Notice he said the city will be captured, the houses looted, the women raped. So that's kind of gruesome picture here. And also partly because of the wickedness of Jerusalem. Verse 3 says, then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fought on the day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, The Mount of Olives will be split in half from east to west, forming a huge valley, so that the mountains will move to the north and half to the south. You will flee by my mountain valley, for the valley of the mountains will extend to Azal. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all of his holy ones with him. Now let's stop here because there's a lot to unpack here. This earthquake, whenever it happened, was mentioned back in the days of Isaiah, the prophet. And again, Isaiah the prophet prophesied about 100 years, about 100 years, maybe 120 years before the Babylonian exile. So at this point around, again, close to 200 years. All right, but this earthquake was mentioned, I believe it was mentioned in Isaiah chapter 6. Okay, let me see what the thing says here. All right, anyway, so I'm just saying this is kind of interesting that it is mentioned. This great, whatever this earthquake is, it seemed like it was a huge earthquake. All right, notice he says that you will flee by my mountain. So let me kind of show you one other thing here. I'm going to go to Matthew chapter 24 as we compare scripture with scripture. Matthew 24, look at verse 15. He says, so when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place. Now, this is another component to this day of the Lord scenario. Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 8, and Daniel chapter 12 talks about this abomination that caused desolation. So he says, this was already spoken of. Then he says, when you see this, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get his things out of the house. A man in the field must not go back to get his clothes. Woe to the pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath, for at that time there will be great tribulation, the kind that hath taken place from the beginning of the world unto now, and never will again. So notice he said this great tribulation. And then he says the kind that hath taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again. Now, in order to fully understand this, you should also read Revelation chapters 6 through 19. All of the stuff that's going on. You also have the kingdom of the beast, the evils of the king of the beast. But notice he said flee to the mountain. So right here, what is going on? You also see this attack against Israel. And so let's go back. He says, then the Lord will go out and fight against those days. The Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on the day of battle. So here we now have to understand, because we get this picture of the second coming of Jesus. And this is something that is so plain. It always baffles me when people butchers this. So let's talk about the second coming itself. Okay? Let's talk about the second coming itself. So Matthew 24 here, it goes on, and then notice what he says, verse 22, unless those days were limited, no one will survive, but those days will be limited because of the elect. If anyone tells you then, look, here is the Messiah, or over here, do not believe it, for false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, in the elect. Take note, I've told you in advance. So if they tell you, look, he is in the wilderness, don't go out. Look, he is in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For if the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Where the carcass is, there the vultures will be gathered. I'm always amazed at how people willfully blind themselves. This is so simple here, and yet I'll say this even more so. I'm always amazed at the goal of people who would then turn around and go, I have the answer. Jesus is coming. I got the timeline of when Jesus is coming. In every generation, there is a false prophecy, a false prediction of when Jesus is coming. Everyone. It's always amazing. In every prophecy, every generation. In fact, I will say we're about due for one about now. You had the one with Y2K. I was a part of a church where they had Y2K sales. They had a whole storefront where they were selling people. A lot of people got deceived. A lot of people divested their investment. Some of them were very wealthy because they believed the pastor that the world was coming to an end in 2000. Before that, that was 1994. Okay, 1994, where the world was going to come to an end. That guy, again, false prophet. Before then, there was 1988. And in 1988, you had this guy who wrote a book, 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back. Part of that was based upon when Israel was formed in 1947. Every generation since Jesus come, you had some crackpot predicting. And what's even sadder is people follow them. People who follow them. Now, unfortunately, the sheep are sheep. And the sheep will follow pretty much anywhere you go. If they identify you as the shepherd, they're going to follow you wherever you tell them to go, even against common sense. And so the idea is, but sometimes too, sheep, when you have a person, a leader that will tell you that, okay, and watch it, and if a person said, I'm convinced through my study, of course, they get into greater lies when they say, the Lord told me, right? The Lord told me, right? Okay, that's then now you're in the false prophecy and you're a false prophet. But let's just say, because there are good pastors that may say, you know what, in my study, and oftentimes you know the good ones because they will preference, I think, or my opinion. But here's the problem with the false teachers that mislead people. Where people say, well, Jesus is coming back on such and such a date. Sometimes they will be, and those who are following them, okay, you trust the man of God, which you shouldn't. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. Why is it that you have to quit your job, sell your business, get rid of all of your goods? If Jesus is coming, does it matter if you sell your goods or not? If the rapture happened, aren't they going to be left anyway? And if Jesus is coming back the way you think he is, okay, why do you have to then sell your goods months before he comes and give them to the pastor? One case was they divested, when people quit their jobs, and this was years ago too. I want to say in the 70s, they quit their jobs because I think one of them was one of my cousins. I had a distant cousin who fell for this. Had a good job. Quit his, they quit their job and moved out into in the country field someplace. Later on, you had a person who followed a kind of distant cousin who followed a fake apostle, and moved into the basement of the church. Why do you have to move into the basement of the church? Where did Jesus ever tell you to move into a basement with anyone? Gather someplace. Where did he ever say, and again, in these prophecies as we're reading them, where did he ever say that you have to gather someplace? Sell all your goods and stuff. Give it to the pastor, all right? And that's usually what happens. You give it to the pastor. Notice he says, if he says he's in the wilderness, don't go out. Let's add to this. If he says it's in the basement, no. Okay? So this is always a problem. Fake pastors, fake prophecies. Okay. Verse 29 says, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, in Zechariah, okay, we're talking about this period of the tribulation period and then followed by the day of the Lord. So then he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not shed its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the celestial powers will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And then he says, now learn the parable of the fig tree. As soon as its branches become tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. Then he says, in the same way, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near at the door. I assure you, this generation will certainly not pass until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, another kind of sad misinterpretation is the fig tree. There's two things here that people misinterpret. The generation, what is referred to as the generation, and the fig tree. And I've heard this many times where a lot of pastors or Bible prophecy teachers will say, well, the fig tree represents Israel. So therefore, when Israel became a nation in 1947, then they said, well, then that generation will not pass away until Jesus came. Well, that generation has, I think we're 2 or 3 generations past. We're about 5 generations past 1947, even though, again, the fig tree did not say it was Israel. The fig tree here is a sign. It was an illustration of, hey, how do you know summer is coming? Well, because when fig tree starts to sprout leaves. That's how you know, right? That's what he's talking about there. And then he says a generation will not pass. And then some people then said, I don't know where they got this from, but they said, well, a generation is 40 years. I haven't seen that anywhere in Scripture. The only way I can think that people came up with that interpretation is that the generation that's noted, that the first generation of Israel that came out of Egypt, and they wandered for 40 years. And then remember, they said that generation would wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Well, okay, he didn't say that was the number of a generation. Now, a generation is not so much as time as it is a group of people, right? So, for example, I'm a generation. My children are a generation. My grandchildren are a generation. So that's 3 generations there. Okay. So now, so the second coming of Jesus then is every eye will see him when he appears. Every eye will see him when he appears. Okay, so that's the second coming of Jesus. He's going to physically come back to the earth. Physically come back to the earth. And then in the next study, we're going to get into what is he going to do when he physically comes back to the earth. And keep this in mind, we're not doing this. This is not an exhaustive study here. So we're not doing it justice. It's not exhaustive. But however, I think it gives us enough information. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.